you didn't sketch anything out yet, that's totally fine. It's pretty easy to sort of catch up. Awesome, Lori, that looks awesome. Perfect. Yep, so I just did a little, and I'm actually working a little bit smaller today in hopes that I was just talking to my husband about how when I'm doing like a demonstration and like talking and teaching, it's like such a different process, right? Than when I'm sitting down making my own art. And I'm like, I'm going even slower than I ever thought I would. And so I'm trying a little bit smaller today to hopefully that'll help me out a little bit. But then I taped my edges. Ooh, perfectly. That looks great. Yep. And then as far as paint today, I just have I have this like set of heavy body acrylics that I'm using, but any acrylics will totally work. As far as colors go, I have like my primaries in black and white. My set does have a green in it, like a darker green color. Other colors that could work really well for this particular landscape, I thought like a yellow ochre or any kind of warmer yellow could be nice versus a cool yellow. Although you could use a cooler yellow too, absolutely. And then, you know, a separate green could be nice. If you have some lighter blues, though, those could be nice. But as always, I'll kind of talk about how to mix the colors I'm making as well. But I just, you know, as always, take your own kind of freedoms and liberations with colors and things like that. And as always, you don't have to make it exactly like we're seeing on the image either.
I'm going to work in watercolor.
Beautiful. Work in watercolor. I love that. And, you know, really sometimes like these paint with me classes, you know, I say the type of paint I'm using, but that doesn't mean you have to use the type of paint I'm using at all. I love that you're bringing what you want to the table and using it. I think that's awesome. So as always, so if you're doing watercolor, what I would say to you is take a minute and just look at the image and ask yourself, is there anything that you need to avoid to keep white? If you have masking fluid, you could paint masking fluid on there. If you don't have masking fluid, you'll just have to be mindful to kind of avoid those areas. So that's, you know, so what I'll do is as I'm kind of talking, I'll mention some tips for if you're painting with watercolor, and if anyone's ever painting with another type of paint, just let me know and I'll talk about strategies and things like that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to apply a very light wash over this today, very light. And I'm going to do a gray wash today to keep it just really neutral. So I'm taking just a little bit of black. Now, if you'd like to skip the wash because you're nervous that it's going to wash out all your lines because you don't have fixative or it's not dark enough, you can skip that. If you are using watercolor, what you can do is do a gray kind of wash just in the lower mountain region and kind of start here and kind of start laying in some grays along here. And then you could also do some grays kind of in here within the grass if you want to, or you could build those up and work light to dark. It's just kind of up to you how you want to do it. But I'm just taking this very, very little bit of black, got like a angled flat here, and I'm just loosely washing this gray over top. And I'm just kind of being gentle with my paintbrush so I don't smudge my lines. I didn't fix mine with spray, but you can fix it with a fixative spray, or even hairspray will do the trick in an aerosol can. It'll just make your pencil lines not smudgy. And again, just to reiterate the purpose of the wash, it is to, so we're starting with a middle value. I'm not working on white as my base, and I'm not working on like a straight black or a super dark as my base. And then also, because acrylic paint is very layerable, it provides a ground for me to begin building up on. Thus, my paint just sits on it nicer. So again, that's the purpose of a wash. It's a very traditional thing to do. All the old masters traditionally did this, but it doesn't mean you can't paint without washing. So even though it's traditional, you can still paint without a wash if you like that better. And then you can start to paint in while your wash is still wet if you want to. But regardless of whether you're doing watercolor or acrylic or even wash, your really next phase is the block in phase. So working with acrylic, I like to work with my dark colors to my light colors. So I would start with kind of all the darks that we're seeing in here, and then maybe some of the pops of darks in the ground here. You know, I could start to bring in the sky. So that's how I'd approach it with acrylic. If you're doing a watercolor painting, you're going to want to start with very light washes, and then you're going to build opacity as you go. This particular painting for watercolor, I think glazing is going to be your best friend. That's where you do layers of color and then do washes over top, especially like within these mountains, because you get a lot of similar colors with slight differences. So doing glazing can help you achieve some really beautiful, rich values. Okay. So what I'm going to do to start is I've got my black here. Now, I'm not going to use like pure black. I'm actually going to put just a touch of green in my black. I have some black paint some green paint, so I'm using that. But if you don't, you can mix your own with yellow and blue. But usually I like my black to have just a little bit more color in it. I don't like it to be just the pure black, because that tends to be pretty flat. And so I like to have my black have a little bit more color into it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start down here. And I do have, so my printer, I had more ink, but it wasn't reading my blue ink. So my image is without any blue in it. So it looks very, the colors are very off. I also have it up on my computer screen for accurate colors, but at least I can kind of show you on here what I'm talking about. So with my dark paint, I'm just going to start kind of popping in little areas down here, so that can start to dry for me to build up layers on top of it. Okay, so again, I mixed some, just some green with my black, and I'm keeping mine pretty loose and just kind of tapping in this kind of as I go. You could try different brushes too to give you just some different effects. So not everything's identical, just gives you some variety. And then keep in mind, as I've mentioned before, if you want to go more realistic, you can count how many little patches you see and try to make it more realistic. But really in this phase, the block in phase, everything's really loose anyway, because I'm going to be layering more color on top of this. This is my bottom layer, what's underneath. So I'm actually kind of painting more than I'll need, but then that will give me room so I can layer some of those greens and warm yellows on top. And the thing too, with watercolor paint, if you're using tube watercolor, you can actually use it a lot like acrylic in many ways. You just don't water it down as much, and it'll sit more on top that way versus blending in and soaking into the paper. So that is something you can try, or start with like lots of washy areas and then do more opaque color on top with less water added into your paint. Just kind of, you know, look all around, and anywhere where I see kind of these little taps of dark or little pops of dark, I just kind of tap that in with my paintbrush. And it's the other thing, I've mentioned this before too, but you know, just because you start with one color doesn't mean you can't go back to it. So I'm just kind of tapping in these darks. You know, maybe I don't get it everywhere I need it, but I'm getting it most places because I can go back and forth a little bit too. to create more texture and more depth. This is just kind of that basic foundation, me blocking in. So I'm just gonna kind of let this sit for a minute, let that dry a little bit, and I'm gonna actually come up and work on my sky. So that way I can bring my sky down a little bit and then paint my mountains over top of that. I'm going to, let's see, for my sky, I like to try to use like a flat brush because I want to try to get like a nice kind of gradient over top of this here. And then we'll kind of blend in some clouds after that. So I'm just taking some white paint here. Try to leave it so you can see my palette too. So I'm doing white with just a little bit of blue because that sky is pretty light. If you're doing watercolor, you know, just some washes of blue can be really pretty, and then you can kind of layer that up and glaze it to get different effects of blue or a gradient. So I'm doing just like a super light blue, mostly white with a little bit of my blue mixed in. And I'm just gonna start kind of back and forth, spreading that over the top here. And you could put just a little bit of water in your brush if you need to, just to make that flow a little bit more. And then you can decide, you know, if you want to add just a little bit more blue in. You know, skies are rarely just one color blue, you know, except for sometimes on those like really bluebird days where it seems like there's no clouds in the sky at all and it's just blue everywhere you look. But other than that, you can kind of blend in some other blues. And then as we get toward the bottom, we'll sort of blend in some more white. And then we see a little strip of kind of gray over here for the cloud. But again, I let my paint kind of layer a little bit. Even if you get it over top of the mountains, just a touch, that's okay. It's not gonna hurt anything, as we'll just paint over top. But keep in mind, if you wanna blend, you've gotta work relatively quickly because you can only blend it while it's wet. And that's true for watercolor as well. Dry watercolor is not going to blend into each other. You need it to still be wet. So you can bring just a little bit of water back into this if you need to, just on your brush, and kind of blend that in. And then what I'll do, I need some more white actually. So I'm just cleaning off my brush a little bit. Grab some white. And then I'm gonna blend in some white to kind of mimic the cloud that's kind of right here. And again, I'm just keeping it pretty loose for now. I'm not trying to blend too much at this point, because we'll kind of detail and texture and add more paint over top of this. So just remember, sometimes blending is an illusion. You're not actually doing it at all. It happens through layering. So it's a little tricky to see on the screen, but what I'll do is I'm just kind of layering in some white, and I can always build this up for more opacity later. And then if you're doing watercolor, keep in mind, if you've got white watercolor paint or white gouache, you can do kind of a more contemporary style where you actually use that and layer that on top. Or if you're wanting to go more traditional, you can just leave the white areas empty and don't paint anything there and use the white of your paper. Just kind of blocking in some white down in here a little bit, and then it kind of goes into some gray. There's a little bit of gray into there. And then, as always, if there's a color or something you don't like in a reference image, remember, you can change it. You don't have to keep it identical if there's something you don't like. Now, one thing I'm loving about this club, and I think all of you that are here today have been so good at this, but just putting your personal spin into the art, your own expression. And that's been really fun for me to see, because as I start to see more of what you do as an individual, I'm starting to recognize your styles, how you like to work. And then, you know, as we progress and move forward, that helps me give you better feedback too, because I can see how you like to work, and and your natural kind of style. And that just helps me, because then if you're more realistic and that's what you're wanting to do, I can help you with that. But if you want to stylize, be more expressive, I can help you with that. But that's the fun part, is feel free to take your own liberations, change colors, remove stuff, add stuff. You are the artist. You can do all of that. Just keep in mind, a reference photo is simply a starting point. Again, just kind of bringing some more blue into here, and then I'm going to bring some gray down in here. I'm just going to grab a little bit of this actually kind of greenish black that I already mixed up, and bring a little bit of white into that just to kind of reactivate it. And I'm just going to use that. Sometimes what I like to do, and this is just something I like to do, and you can take it or leave it, but I like to use existing colors I have on my palette, because I think it helps bring unity to your entire piece. So now I've got a little subtle green in here that you really can't tell, but it just kind of matches the same kind of vibe I have going down here. And again, it's sometimes tricky to see true colors on the screen, but it's something I think if you do that, you'll be able to see with your own eye. I'm just gonna kind of bring that in, kind of keep it loose, tap in just a little bit of gray over here just to give a little bit of, shadow to some of these clouds, depending on how the light hits it. Sometimes we see shadows on our clouds. So just keeping it kind of loose, just lightly tapping in my brush. I hardly have any paint on my brush, in fact, right there. So I'll just kind of hold that up. Just kind of tapped in a little bit, and more white will go on top and kind of define these little edges a little bit more, but that's just there for me to kind of have to work with later. So the last thing I'm going to do before I kind of start blocking in some of the mountains here is just, I've got a couple other little cloud areas I just kind of want to tap in, just so those can dry and I can build on those layers. I did mention too in the post, if you have sponges can be really fun for clouds and things. You can cut them up, sort of shape them. Brushes of course still work too, and you can just kind of use different brushes and hold them differently. Try loading just the tip with paint versus the entire area of your bristles with paint, just for different effects. It's okay to be experimental too in these paintings and just try things. So now looking at these mountains can be tricky, and I picked these mountains on purpose because I thought they had some nice layers that you could transfer to maybe other types of mountains that you might want to paint. So this is kind of tricky, but what we basically have to do, and I'll hold this up here just so, again, the color's off, but you can see all the texture at least. So basically, to the best of your ability, you kind of have to almost, with your imagination, pull the texture away and try to look at kind of the loose shapes underneath. So we're kind of working with some white and some light gray, and then we're going to kind of just block in all these light areas, and then we'll kind of go back and forth between dark and light, dark and light, dark and light a little bit as we're going through here. Another different way to do it is you could start kind of with some of your darks and define some of these areas and kind of pop in texture, much like we did down here. And then you could kind of layer your white over top. So again, there's not just one way to do something. And that's the fun part about painting and art, is it's problem solving. You get to figure out your best approach based on, looking at something. So, and I'm just gonna actually start with a lighter gray. So it's not going to be a super dark gray, just to kind of put in a little bit of a foundation. The mountains I'm approaching just a little bit differently than blocking in, just because we are going to go back and forth a little bit. So I'm going to grab actually a smaller paintbrush too. Because I painted smaller. So what I'm going to do is just kind of pop in some kind of gray and just define my edges a little bit. against that sky a minute. And I'm just using a gray to do it. Sometimes I'll draw on my paintings just with a neutral color like this that's in the painting as well. And just to kind of define my lines. This is something I like to do. So, you know, if you find this is helpful for you, you can do it too. If you don't, then you can skip it. But I just like to take a minute and define those shapes just a little bit, especially when they're kind of intricate like these mountains and I'm painting a little bit smaller. I just don't want to lose them. If I was painting really large scale, I probably wouldn't do this so much. Just when you're painting smaller, it's kind of a different experience. And even though this kind of mountain is much darker, still going to define that too. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. So actually I'm going to bring some more black into my palette a minute, and I am going to block in some of these darks actually, because as I was outlining, I kind of was thinking about how that is going to help us define everything else actually. So so keep in mind, you can change your mind about what you're going to work on. So I'm going to block in this kind of dark area here. I'm going to take some black with some of my green, just like I did before. And I'm going to kind of mix that in with that gray I had already made. So I've got this kind of grayish, darkish green going on here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to block in this mountain here. I'm just using the edge of my flat to kind of shape it and then paint that in. There are some variations within this mountain, which you could at this time, if you wanted to, just kind of loosely like add a little bit of white into your brush, and then you can kind of block in where it's a little bit lighter. And I just kind of keep my brush really loose as I'm doing this. And I'll just kind of hop back and forth to some darker tones, some lighter tones, and then I'll just kind of block that in all together to just kind of get like a base, kind of the base of the mountain there. And then I'm going to do the same thing kind of all down here using those same colors. I've got black, green, and white in there. Keep in mind when black and white come together, make gray and then mix with a color that's called a tone. And you're going to get a different effect when you have a tone versus just black into a color. I'm just going to actually pop in a couple more darks in here. And then now what I'm doing is still using that same color and that same brush, and I'm just going to kind of fill in some of these areas down here at the bottom a little bit. I'm not keeping it perfect, but I'm just trying to mimic the dark shapes that I see. And I did paint some of them in on purpose. And again, I'm keeping it kind of loose because I'll paint layers on top of this as we go. This is that kind of initial, some of those initial darks. Then I can mix a little bit more of the light. Kind of like it's gray with more white than black with some of the green and black mixture. That's what I'm painting with right now. And again, I'm just kind of loosely blocking in where I see kind of light values or medium values, lighter values than I was working with. I'm not worrying about little details. There are some little trees in there, but I'm going to put those in after. First things first, I just want to loosely block in these mountains at the bottom. And keep in mind, you can try different brushes, move around between brushes to get kind of different effects. I try to use somewhat bigger brushes and keep it loose in this stage. And that's the thing too, is don't be afraid to be loose. You know, that's the fun thing about painting, you know, versus drawing, is we have the freedom to be super expressive and have lots of fun lines with our paintbrush. So don't be afraid to, you know, try different things. You can always paint over it if there's something you don't like. So I'm just going in, trying to fill in all these like little empty areas. Again, no really perfect recipe here. And then we're going to be able to kind of glaze other colors and other shapes and stuff on top of this after it dries. So keep in mind, this is not our final, necessarily has to be finally what it looks like. And I'm just making sure I'm liking where all my darks are, and then I'll kind of block in some of the upper mountains a little bit. Okay, so now I've got kind of this loose kind of base down here. So now the first thing I'm going to do with the mountains is I'm actually going to make a dark gray. So a dark gray with a teensy tiny touch of blue in it. And I'm going to bring the bottom part, kind of this area of the mountain in. So really dark gray, touch of blue that I already had on my palette. All right, and then, so it's kind of like a triangular shape. So I'm using an angled flat, a smaller one. I'm just kind of blocking in those kind of dark shapes now. And I, you know, just kind of loosely looking at the reference image to see, you know, how far do these, you know, dark shapes go up. I'm just keeping it real loose because we'll be layering anyway. Sometimes what I'm doing right here is fun to try with like a palette knife, if you want to get more textural with it. So that's something you can do too, if you're painting with acrylic or if you're ever trying oil. So anywhere where I'm seeing some kind of little darks, I'm using my brush kind of on its side now. And just kind of putting in, it's not filling every little area, but just kind of giving it some little bit of texture. I'm just shaping the mountain a little bit. So keep in mind, all these dark values are necessary, so it helps create depth and space. These dark values are going to recede and go back. And then when we start putting in the lights, things are going to start coming forward at us. And the more you kind of paint too, the more you're going to feel comfortable with the process, you know, of how things look in between before they're finished or before, you know, they start to have some of those details we like to see. I think you learn so much about process when you paint that way. Cool. So to me, this looks pretty good for now. I feel like I've got enough darks in to start bringing in some of my light values, and then to go backward and to get some more darks, you know, as I need to. So I'm gonna just kind of let this all dry a little bit up here, which doesn't take a super long time, but I'm gonna come back down to the bottom. Oops, go. My camera did a little thing. Okay, so my yellow is a fairly cool yellow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a yellow and an orange, and I'm going to use some of the orange to warm my yellow. So if you have like a yellow ochre or even like a cadmium yellow dark, that could be really nice. And then take my orange here. So after you make your orange, just mix that in with your yellow. And you can make yourself like a nice kind of warm yellow. You can even put a touch of white in there to give it just a little bit of, that's what it looks like. So this is kind of a cool yellow mixed with a touch of orange and some white. That's what I did to get this color. Now, if you want to kind of make it like a little brownish, you could put just a teensy tiny touch of blue in here, which would lower the intensity and kind of give it a little brownish color. So I'm actually going to do just a teensy bit of blue in here. I do want to just kind of mute that out just a little bit. I don't want it so bright, so intense. So darken that up just a little bit. And if you ever have questions about color combinations or how to make a color, let me know, because all these tubes of colors you see, a lot of them can be mixed just with your primaries. So if you're ever needing help with colors or troubleshooting colors, how do I get this? Feel free to let me know. And then what I'm going to do now is just kind of almost that same little process as I did in the beginning, where I'm just going to kind of start tapping in some of this lighter color now. Again, this is just a block in. This is just the background, I should say. You will be adding more color, more texture on top. So again, I just keep it very, very loose in the beginning. And you can play with color a little bit. Color, because you'll be layering it, it doesn't have to be perfect in that first layer. So sometimes, maybe I'll have it be darker, or maybe sometimes I'll have it be extra bright to just bring a fun pop of color into it. I mean, this is a relatively neutral image, but sometimes it's fun to just bring in extra pops of color. And how I'm doing this down here, I'm just sort of tapping to get texture versus, going back and forth and having it be really smooth. And, to me, texture is the fun part of painting. It's figuring out, how do I want to get this area to look like what I'm seeing? How could I recreate that texture? How could I mimic that? And so for me, that's kind of like figuring out, could I tap my brush? Could I, apply paint to just the bristles? Do I need extra water in my brush? It's kind of, asking yourself those questions, like, how could I break down this texture? And the more you do that, the more confident you'll get, I think, with painting in general. And to me, this is just something I'm going to kind of layer and layer. And at the very end, I'll be using probably like a little scripty brush like this and pulling out some little itty bitty fine lines on top of kind of this loose textury blocking I'm doing. So again, I'm just kind of stressing that because, sometimes with our time, we don't always get to finish a whole painting together, depending. So I am setting up some of our next Paint With Me classes coming up will be series classes. So we won't actually finish a whole painting in one session, but we'll work on them over time together. and sort of build them up that way. But as always, I think, getting the foundation from our live classes too like this is really good, because then you can kind of take it on your own and finish it as well, which can be kind of fun, because then it's you doing it, not necessarily following along with me. And I think that can be really fun as well. I think there's a time for both. But again, I'm just keeping this super duper loose right now. And if I look at the image on my screen compared to this, I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm starting to loosely see that. I mean, there's more little areas of dark that need to come in. There's more light areas that need to come in. There's little flecks of green in there that will come into play, but I'll layer that on top of this, okay? So now the last thing really to finish my block in is the white of the mountains. And then I would say this is a blocked in painting. Then I'm ready for my details and my kind of finishing touches. And to me, I constitute a block in being finished by meaning like paint is covering the entire surface. And that would be true of watercolor, acrylic, oil, wash, whatever you're painting with. The other thing I want you to take a look at, if you've got your image, if you notice the white in the mountains, try to take note of where it's like pure, kind of purish white. To me, the white almost has like a little bit of a cool kind of tone to it. So I even just tap in just a teensy tiny, like the tiniest bit of blue into my white paint, just to give it that kind of sense of coolness. It's like you can hardly even see it. It's just enough to give it that little kind of cool sense. And keep in mind too, with our mountains being in the background, cool colors tend to recede and go back in space, whereas warm colors tend to come forward. So if you look at this image here, we've got cool mountains in the background pushing back, and then we've got kind of the warmness in the, field in front coming forward. So that's really our goal, is to end with a kind of cool background and a warm kind of foreground. Now, as far as the white, there are a lot of intricacies in these mountains that you could be very kind of technical with and take your time. And, like I talked about before, how could you interpret some of these textures? But for me, I'm just, kind of loosely painting in. Again, I like to just keep things loose. It's just my style. I'm just loosely blocking in white where I see it, just to kind of get that foundation of color on my page, so then I can come back and add in kind of my darks and details. Dark details, I guess, is what I was going for, because we've got all those like fun little shadows and little textures of the mountains. Could you just kind of tap your brush a little bit? What happens if you only have a little bit of paint versus a lot of paint on your bristles? I think the more you paint, the more you're going to learn. And there's so much self-discovery that happens in art making. I think that's why I love teaching it so much, is because truly I become a facilitator, and I guide as you discover and as you learn. And I think that's just a really fun thing to do, because as everybody's doing something different on their paper, new discoveries are like happening all the time. And you're going to find things that work well for you versus things that, don't work as well for you. And so that's why I always try to approach it as, this is how you could do it, but you could also do it this way, or you could try it this way, because there's multiple approaches, and I never want anyone to feel like you have to do it this one exact way, because that's not what art's about at all. It's about, learning process, learning technique, but then, learning or discovering how you want to apply those techniques and skills to create what you want to. So now just a little technique I'm doing. I'm I'm kind of tapping some of this extra paint off of my brush, just on my palette, but you could do it on a paper towel too, just so there's less paint on my brush. And now I'm just kind of doing a little bit of lighter tapping just to kind of get some of that, you know, those other textures we see. I'll just lift this up a little bit too so you can see that better. But, and you can do this with watercolor as well, if you've got white watercolor paint. If you don't have white watercolor paint and you're going more traditional, you can just use the dark instead and tap it on the white. Whereas acrylic, I go back and forth, and I use both because the paint sits on top of it. With watercolor, I would, you know, you just approach it a little bit differently because of the medium itself. But if you're doing acrylic, you know, feel free to go back and forth. Now's the time where I could, okay, I've got some dark still on my palette here. So I'm gonna put this on my brush, let that white just mix with it. So I've got kind of some gray now, and I'm gonna kind of just tap in some gray. The other thing I want to encourage you to do often is hold up your painting and look, just hold it back and look at it too. So remember, you are up close on top of it all the time when you're painting, and so your perspective is different. So you got to hold it back every once in a while to look at it with fresh eyes. Okay, so don't be afraid to stop, stand up, look at it, step back. You know, different perspectives are really wonderful. And usually for me, before I can decide if I'm truly done with a painting, I need to step back from it and look at it for a few minutes and kind of assess it and think about it in a different way than being so close to it. I've got this like little, I found this at Michael's. It's a Princeton, it's called Princeton brush. It's a mixed media brush, and it's really textury. Like, it's almost like a stencil brush, but little. And it is awesome for like these kind of mountainy textures because I can just use it and sort of tap. And I get this really kind of, I'll just hold it up and show you too. I get this really kind of beautiful, subtle texture where it's just really light. And I think the key to getting those mountains looking like mountains, whether or not, you know, mine are identical to the picture, I think we can all agree, you know, they look like mountains. It's a matter of knowing where there's a hard edge or a soft edge, where it's kind of lightly textured versus really solid and opaque. And I think the juxtaposition or the contrast of those types of textures and lines is what makes it so successful and look like mountains. And of course, there's all different types of mountains depending on where you are, but you know, at any given time, I feel like when you're looking up at mountains, you're seeing all these different planes because of all the different edges, and if it's rocky or, you know, plains, and light hits them all differently depending on how the sun is. And of course, when you add clouds to the sky, then you've got, you know, the light being directed in all kinds of ways. So that's kind of the fun part with mountains, is you're playing with light and texture, really, is what it comes down to. And, you know, you can kind of go back and forth, and just play with texture until you're liking it. Keep in mind a couple simple things. That wet paint is going to blend together, and the colors will fuse. Whereas if you let an area dry and then paint on top, it's going to sit on top and not blend so much. So with my mountains, I like to do a combo of both. I like some to kind of blend, but then I'll let it sit here for a minute and dry and then come back into it. So keep that in mind too when you're doing an acrylic painting. It's fun to hop around. And so we've got a little bit of time left here. So I want to I'm going to warm up this down here just a little bit to kind of show you, hopefully we can get that sense of what happens when things start to come forward a little bit at you. So let's see, I need some more white. So I'm going to start with white as my base. I'll try to mix my color up here so you can see it. So I'm starting with some white and then yellow, kind of as my like foundation color. And I've been like mixing with paintbrushes this whole time because I feel like my painting is small, so it's just kind of easy. But you can always mix with a palette knife as well. Just put a little bit of yellow into there. And so this particular yellow I have, any yellow that is kind of like a lemony yellow kind of color is going to be a cool yellow. So again, a way to warm this up, I could just take just a little teensy tiny bit of red or orange, a pre-mixed orange, and just mix that in. And that's going to help warm up the yellow and bring it to a warmer yellow. Need more orange in there. And again, sometimes I like to pre-mix my orange ahead of time and then bring that orange into it, because you'll get a different effect if you pre-mix an orange versus if you try to mix it into your existing color that you already have. So don't be afraid to like play with like colors too, different color combinations. I'll even sometimes have like a little swatch sheet that I keep when I'm painting to just think about colors as I'm going. Just need some more yellow into here. I think mine's maybe like a little bit brighter than it actually is, but I'm kind of liking it, so I'm going to use it anyway. And then I'm just going to kind of start tapping with some lighter colors. I'm not filling everything up this time. Sometimes what I'll like to do is I'll take a secondary dry paint brush, and you can kind of use that to kind of move paint around a little bit. I mean, and again, my style is very textury, is very expressive, it's very stylized versus things being hyper realistic. That's just like how I like to paint. So keep in mind, you don't always have to interpret a texture the same exact way I do. You know, this is that creative part that you can think about what would be fun. Do you want to bring a sponge into it? Do you want to kind of take a little tiny liner brush and get lots of those little lines and edges in there versus, you know, kind of tapping and creating texture instead? Or do you want to kind of have a combo? You know, I feel like I'm a combo. I have, you know, all these little components of kind of very realistic elements mixed or juxtaposed with more kind of expressive types of elements. So it's just, again, a matter of what you like to do. I just think a good rule of thumb is if you do something in one place, do it in another, meaning repeat, so things look unified. So if you use a color somewhere, like I'm kind of mixing in some different types of yellowy kind of colors, and mine's a little bit more pastel-y than the real picture, but I'm kind of liking it, so I'm going with it. But I'm just making sure I tap this color in multiple areas, not just one or two or even three places, but multiple spots, you know, and kind of mimicking the texture in multiple spots. That way it looks unified. It looks on purpose. That's the key to stylization, is you want things to be intentional. You know, you want to think about why you're doing that thing, you know? I'm just using this is kind of a dry, scratchy paintbrush, but that's why I like to keep ruined paintbrushes sometimes. They can be some of the best ones for playing with texture or moving around paint. So it's like after I put paint on my paper, I can move it around and manipulate it, scratch into it, use a sgraffito technique. You know, and for here, I might warm this up just a little bit more. So I'm actually going to make my orange first, like I did before. And then remember, if you want to mute a color a little bit, you can mix its complement with it. So if I wanted to mute my orange color a little bit, I could add just a little bit of blue, and it just helps lower the intensity of the color. Let's see. Bring some of this in here. Yeah, I just sometimes color for me, it's not like a perfect recipe. I'm constantly mixing on my palette. I'm constantly, adding new colors. I like to sometimes put, you know, or not natural, you could say, not realistic colors underneath, and then put realistic colors on top. That can be kind of a fun way to play with texture and light and color. So again, these are just all things I'm saying to you because they're all things you could do if you wanted to, it's just there's all these like fun variations and things you can do when you're painting. And the thing I always try to keep in mind is I get to create something for someone else to see. I'm a little bit of a broken record sometimes, but it's like you don't have to show people your reference photo that you used, and we're using something royalty free, or you could use something you took. But even then, people don't need you to see that because that was just a starting point, and especially if you're changing things and making them your own, you don't need to worry about, if it's identical to the image unless that's your goal. And I can bring in some more darks here too to just kind of balance. See if I got any. It's wet still. Bringing in those darks back in will help recede. Areas will go back in space. And then to me, the finishing kind of touch after I got all my layers in, I would use, like I said, a teensy tiny little like script or liner brush. And I would do some like little flicks of grass. Do just a few. Maybe take a little bit of green with some yellow. Create a nice yellow green color. You don't want it to be super dark. But sometimes that's what I'll do just for that little kind of last little detail. And I might mix some of this yellow in with that green just to kind of, again, make it unified. And I can even take like this little liner brush and just kind of, I'll hold it up in just a minute so you can see too. And if you put a little water in with a liner brush, you'll get like a nice thin little line. And what you can do here is just create, some more definition on top of something that's very loose. Let's see if I can. So if you can see kind of like these little lines, like I can kind of bring little line work on top of something that's very loose like that. And then that just kind of can help unify it, bring it together, all of that. Well, we only have a few minutes, so I do want to stop so we can just chat for a minute. But just to kind of say too, to wrap this particular painting up would be me kind of going into the mountains a little bit more, kind of playing with texture, maybe taking a